Single dad didn't know the open safe was a trap set by the millionaire, what he did next. To the single parent listening right now, before we continue, let this remind you, you are not failing. You are fighting. You are brave, you are not alone, and your child is lucky to have you. And for my lovely viewers, your kindness, your time, your quiet strength, it all matters here. You're part of this story too. Bill Henderson's hands trembled as he stared at the massive steel safe standing wide open in the corner of the most luxurious library he'd ever seen. Stacks upon stacks of crisp $100 bills were bundled neatly inside, more money than he'd ever imagined in one place. His heart hammered against his ribs as he glanced toward the ornate doorway, listening for footsteps that never came. The silence in the Ashworth mansion was deafening. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock ticked away the seconds, each one feeling like an eternity as Bill stood frozen between his electrical tools and a fortune that could solve every problem crushing down on his shoulders. Just 3 hours earlier, he had been a different man. A desperate man, yes, but still a man with principles. Now, standing in this palace of marble and crystal, those principles felt like luxuries he could no longer afford. The eviction notice crumpled in his work-shirt pocket seemed to burn against his chest. 30 days. That's all he and his 8-year-old son Ethan had left before they'd be sleeping in his pickup truck or, worse, separated by a system that would place Ethan in foster care while Bill figured out how to rebuild their shattered life. Bill's weathered hands, scarred from years of electrical work, reached toward the safe. Then stopped. Then reached again. The money wasn't just sitting there, it was calling to him, whispering promises of salvation. Rent money. Medicine money. A chance for Ethan to breathe without that terrible wheezing sound that kept Bill awake at night, listening through thin apartment walls for any sign that his son's lungs were giving up the fight. He thought about this morning, about the way Ethan had tried to hide another asthma attack, pressing his small face into his pillow to muffle the coughing. The boy was 8 years old and already knew that his medical condition was bankrupting them. What kind of father lets his child carry that burden? Bill had pulled on his cracked leather work boots in the pre-dawn darkness, the same boots he'd worn for 3 years because new ones weren't in the budget. Not when Ethan's inhaler cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Not when the specialists who might actually help his son required payment upfront, no exceptions, no payment plans, no mercy for working-class fathers who were already drowning. The drive to the Ashworth estate had been like traveling to another planet. Bill's rusted pickup truck had coughed and wheezed almost as badly as Ethan, struggling up the winding road that led to a world where money was never a problem, where children got the best medical care as easily as breathing. Mrs. Abernathy, the kind-faced housekeeper, had greeted him at the servants' entrance with the same warm smile she'd offered for 6 months of service calls. She was a grandmother figure with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's soul, though she'd never made Bill feel judged for his worn clothes or calloused hands. "Good morning, Bill," she had said, ushering him through corridors lined with paintings that probably cost more than his annual salary. "Mr. Ashworth is in meetings all morning, but the heating unit in the library has been acting up again. Making terrible noises all night, keeping the poor man awake." Poor man. Bill had almost laughed at the irony. William Ashworth, tech mogul and billionaire, losing sleep over a noisy heater while Bill Henderson lay awake calculating whether he could afford both Ethan's medicine and food for the week. The library had taken Bill's breath away, as it always did. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they belonged in a museum. A Persian rug that was probably older than America itself. A fireplace large enough to park a car inside. And behind the massive oak desk, positioned like a monument to wealth and power, the safe. Bill had seen it before during previous service calls, but it had always been closed, locked tight with a digital keypad that probably cost more than Bill's monthly rent. Today was different. Today, the heavy steel door hung open like an invitation, or maybe a temptation, revealing more cash than Bill had ever seen outside of a movie. He forced himself to focus on the heating unit, unpacking his tools with hands that shook despite his efforts to stay calm. The problem should have been simple, a relay switch that needed replacement, maybe an hour's work at most. But every few minutes, his eyes drifted back to that open safe, and his mind began calculating exactly how much difference that money could make. The top bundle alone looked like it contained at least $50,000. Enough to pay the back rent, cover Ethan's medical bills for the next year, maybe even move them to a better apartment in a neighborhood where Bill wouldn't have to worry about his son walking to school past drug dealers and broken glass. Bill's father had raised him to be better than this. Robert Henderson had been a mechanic who worked 16-hour days to keep food on the table after Bill's mother had abandoned them when Bill was 12 years old. He'd never stolen so much as a pack of gum, even when they were down to their last dollar and the electricity was about to be shut off. Integrity, his father had said during one of their late-night talks, usually while sharing a single can of soup for dinner, is doing the right thing even when no one's watching. Especially when no one's watching. But his father had never watched his child struggle to breathe. He'd never held a tiny hand while paramedics worked to save his son's life in the back of an ambulance. He'd never faced the impossible choice between rent and medicine, knowing that the wrong decision could cost his child everything. Bill set down his electrical tester and took a step toward the safe. The Persian rug was so thick beneath his work boots that his footsteps made no sound. Another step. Another. The money seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the library's tall windows, each bill crisp and perfect and promising. He could take just a few bundles from the middle of the stack. Mr. Ashworth probably wouldn't even notice. The man was worth billions. What was a few thousand to someone who owned houses in 3 countries and a yacht that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings? Bill's hands hovered over the cash, so close he could smell the distinctive scent of new bills. His fingers twitched, wanting to grab what his son needed to survive, what any father would take to save his child's life. But then he heard it, not a sound from the mansion, but an echo from his memory. His father's voice, patient and loving despite the exhaustion that came from working multiple jobs just to keep them afloat. Son, there are going to be times in your life when everything inside you screams to take the easy path. Times when doing the wrong thing seems like the only way to survive. That's when you find out what kind of man you really are. Bill had been 15 when his father said those words, frustrated and angry about their poverty, about watching his classmates have things he could never afford. He'd wanted to know why they had to struggle when it seemed like everyone else had it easy. The easy path isn't really easy, his father had continued, his grease-stained hands steady on the steering wheel of their beat-up Ford as they drove home from another failed job interview. It might solve your problems today, but it creates bigger problems tomorrow. And the biggest problem of all is that once you cross that line, once you decide that your need justifies taking what isn't yours, it becomes easier to cross it again. And again. Until one day you wake up and realize you're not the man you thought you were. Standing in William Ashworth's library, surrounded by more wealth than he'd ever imagined, Bill finally understood what his father had meant. This wasn't just about money. It was about who he chose to be in this moment when no one was watching, when his need was desperate and his justification was perfect. Bill's hand trembled as it moved, not toward the money, but toward the safe's heavy steel door. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, he swung it closed. The mechanism engaged with a solid thunk that echoed through the library like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. The temptation was gone, locked away behind steel and his own choice to remain the man his father had raised him to be. But the weight of that choice pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had just walked away from his son's salvation, from their chance at a life where medical bills didn't dictate every decision. Bill returned to the heating unit with a focus born of desperation. If he couldn't solve his problems by taking what wasn't his, then he'd solve them the way he always had, through honest work and determination. The relay switch was more complicated than he'd initially diagnosed, part of a system that had been slowly degrading for months. But Bill attacked the problem with everything he had, channeling his emotions into his expertise. 2 hours later, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air, Bill finally had the system running smoothly. Better than it had in years, actually. The heating unit hummed with quiet efficiency, the kind of repair that would last for decades with proper maintenance. Impressive work. Bill spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. William Ashworth stood in the library doorway, and for a moment, Bill wondered if he'd been watching, if he'd seen the moment at the safe. The billionaire was younger than Bill had expected, maybe mid-40s, with graying temples and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Mr. Ashworth, Bill managed, wiping his hands on a shop rag. I didn't hear you come in. The system should be running perfectly now. The relay switch was failing, but I've replaced it with a high-grade component that should last much longer. Ashworth nodded, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. He walked to his desk with casual confidence, the kind of bearing that came from never having to worry about money, never having to choose between necessities. Almost absently, he tried the handle of the safe. Finding it locked, he turned to Bill with an expression that was impossible to read. Interesting, he said quietly. Bill felt ice form in his stomach. Had he made a mistake? Should he have left the safe alone entirely? Maybe there was some reason it had been left open, some test he'd failed by interfering. Sir. Bill ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. Ashworth studied him for a long moment, and Bill felt like he was being examined under a microscope. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and answers that Bill didn't understand. "Bill, isn't it?" Ashworth finally said. "Mrs. Abernathy speaks very highly of you. Says you've been coming here for months, always professional, always honest. Never had a single complaint about your work." "Yes, sir. I try to do good work." The words felt inadequate, but Bill didn't know what else to say. "I'm sure you do." Ashworth moved to the tall windows overlooking his manicured grounds, gardens that probably employed a dozen people full-time. "Tell me, Bill, what do you see when you look out there?" Bill joined him at the window, confused by the question. The view was breathtaking, rolling lawns that looked like green velvet, flower beds arranged in perfect geometric patterns, trees that had been shaped and pruned into living sculptures. "Your garden, sir? It's beautiful." "I see choices," Ashworth said, his voice thoughtful. "Every plant, every tree, every stone was placed deliberately. Someone had to decide where it would go, what purpose it would serve, how it would fit into the larger design. Some choices are easy: put the roses where they'll get morning sun, place the fountain where it can be seen from the house. Others are much harder." Bill remained silent, sensing that something important was happening but not understanding what. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the library's Persian rug. "I left that safe open on purpose," Ashworth continued, his words falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. "It's something I do with everyone who works in my home alone. A little test, you might say." The ice in Bill's stomach spread through his entire body. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no words came. "You closed it," Ashworth said, turning away from the window to face Bill directly. "You were alone in this room for over 2 hours with more cash than most people see in a lifetime, and you closed it. Do you know how rare that is?" Bill's mouth felt like sandpaper. "I couldn't take something that wasn't mine. Even though you clearly need it." The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Bill thought about lying, about maintaining what little pride he had left, but something in Ashworth's manner, not judgment, but genuine curiosity, demanded honesty. "Yes," he said quietly. "I need it. My son, he has severe asthma. The medical bills, the rent, we got an eviction notice this morning." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "But needing something doesn't make it right to steal it." Ashworth's expression softened, and for the first time, Bill saw past the billionaire facade to something more human underneath. "My father was a factory worker in Detroit," Ashworth said, settling into one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than Bill's monthly salary. "Raised 4 kids on $30 a week and never missed a day of work in 23 years. When the plant closed and he got laid off, I watched him stand in unemployment lines and food banks, too proud to ask family for help but too desperate to let his children go hungry." Bill listened, surprised by this glimpse into the billionaire's past. It was hard to imagine William Ashworth, surrounded by such incredible wealth, ever knowing what it felt like to worry about money. "One day," Ashworth continued, "my father found a wallet on the sidewalk outside the unemployment office. It had over $800 in it, more money than we'd seen since he lost his job. I was with him when he found it, 12 years old and hungry because we'd had nothing but peanut butter sandwiches for 3 days. What did he do? He looked through it until he found the owner's address, and we walked 6 miles across town to return it. 6 miles, Bill, in Detroit winter, because we couldn't afford bus fare. The man who answered the door was wearing a suit that probably cost more than our rent for 3 months. He thanked my father, took the wallet, and closed the door. No reward, no acknowledgement of what it had cost us to be honest." Bill could picture it, the long walk through cold streets, the hope that maybe this act of honesty would somehow be rewarded, the disappointment when it wasn't. "I was furious," Ashworth admitted. "I asked my father why he didn't just keep it. We needed it more than some rich man in a fancy house. Do you know what he told me?" Bill shook his head, though he suspected he could guess. "He said, 'Son, if I steal that money, I might feed my family tonight, but I'll starve my soul forever. And a man with a starved soul can't teach his children how to be better than their circumstances.' It took me years to understand what he meant." Ashworth stood and walked to his desk, opening a drawer and pulling out a thick envelope. The gesture was casual, but Bill sensed that nothing about this moment was casual. "I've been looking for someone like you, Bill. Someone with integrity, with character. Someone who understands that who you are matters more than what you have." He held out the envelope. "This is a check for $50,000. Consider it payment for services rendered." Bill stared at the envelope as if it might burst into flames. "Sir, I can't, that's too much. I just fixed a heating unit." "You did more than that," Ashworth said firmly. "You passed a test that most people fail. You chose character over comfort, integrity over immediate gratification. That's worth more than any heating repair." Bill's hands shook as he took the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid to hope that this might be real. "But it's not a gift," Ashworth continued. "It's an investment. I'm starting a foundation, a fund to help working families facing medical emergencies. People who fall through the cracks of our healthcare system, who work hard but can't catch a break when crisis strikes. I need someone to run it, someone who understands what it's like to choose between rent and medicine." The words seemed to come from far away, as if Bill was hearing them through water. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a purpose. The salary is $120,000 a year, plus full medical benefits for you and your son. We'll start small, maybe help a dozen families the first year. But if we do it right, if we choose the right people to help and help them the right way, we can grow it into something that changes lives." Bill thought about Ethan, probably sitting by the window right now in their cramped apartment, watching for his father's truck to pull into their cracked driveway. He thought about the nebulizer humming in the background of their lives, about medical bills that arrived like clockwork, about the weight of trying to be everything to someone who needed so much. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because you closed the safe," Ashworth said simply. "In a world where most people would have found a way to justify taking what they needed, you did what was right. That's the kind of character you can't teach, Bill. It's either there or it isn't. And it's exactly what this foundation needs." Bill's vision blurred as he opened the envelope. Inside was indeed a check, made out in his name, for an amount that would not only solve their immediate crisis but provide security he'd never dared to dream of. But more than that, it represented something he'd almost lost faith in, the idea that doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything, still mattered in this world. "There's one condition," Ashworth added, and Bill looked up, waiting for the catch that would make this all too good to be true. "Every person we help, every family we save from the kind of desperation you've been facing, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that integrity has a price, but it also has a reward. Sometimes we have to wait for that reward, sometimes we have to choose to believe it's coming even when we can't see it. But it comes, Bill. It always comes." The drive home was a blur of tears and disbelief. Bill had to pull over twice just to compose himself, to make sure this wasn't some elaborate dream brought on by stress and desperation. But the check was real, solid in his hands, and so was the business card Ashworth had given him with the foundation's attorney's contact information. Ethan was waiting by the window when Bill's truck finally pulled into their driveway, just as he'd predicted. The boy's face lit up when he saw his father, and Bill realized that no amount of money could ever compare to that smile, to the trust and love he saw in his son's eyes. "How was work, Daddy?" Ethan asked as Bill scooped him up in a hug that lasted much longer than usual. "Different than I expected, buddy," Bill said, breathing in the scent of his son's hair, feeling the slight wheeze in his breathing that would soon be a thing of the past. "Very different." That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep with his inhaler close at hand, Bill sat at their small kitchen table and called the number on Ashworth's business card. The attorney, a woman named Sarah Chen, had been expecting his call and walked him through the details of his new position with the Henderson Family Foundation. The foundation would officially launch in 30 days, giving Bill time to transition from his electrical work and for Ethan to finish the school semester. They'd provide a fully furnished office in downtown Albany, complete with staff and resources to identify and help families in crisis. "Mr. Ashworth was very specific about the foundation's mission," Sarah explained. "It's not just about providing financial assistance, though that's certainly part of it. It's about restoring dignity to people who are struggling, showing them that their character and efforts have value even when the system seems stacked against them." 6 months later, Bill sat in his bright, welcoming office overlooking the Hudson River, a far cry from the cramped apartment where he'd once calculated whether they could afford both food and medicine. The Henderson Family Foundation had helped 43 families navigate medical crises, and each success story felt like a personal victory. On his desk sat 2 framed photographs. The first showed Ethan at his new school, healthy and happy, his asthma well controlled with proper medication and the kind of comprehensive care that was no longer a financial burden. The boy had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds, transformation that spoke to both better nutrition and the absence of the constant stress that had defined their previous life. The second photograph meant even more to Bill, a picture of his father, taken just months before he'd passed away from a heart attack when Bill was 25. In the photo, Robert Henderson was wearing his work clothes, his hands stained with motor oil, but his eyes were clear and proud. Bill had learned that his father was right about integrity having a price, but he'd also learned something his father maybe never knew. Sometimes, when you're willing to pay that price, the universe finds a way to pay you back with interest. Every morning when Bill arrived at the foundation, he thought about that open safe and the choice he'd made. It had been the hardest easy decision of his life, easy because he knew what was right, hard because doing right had seemed like it would cost him everything. Instead, it had given him everything he'd never dared to dream of. The phone on his desk rang, pulling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, which usually meant another family in crisis, another chance to prove that integrity wasn't just about what you didn't take, it was about what you chose to give. Henderson Family Foundation, this is Bill. He answered, ready to change another life the way his own had been changed by the simple act of closing a door that should never have been left open in the first place. The voice on the other end was that of a young mother, crying as she explained that her daughter needed surgery they couldn't afford, that insurance had denied the claim, that she'd heard about the foundation from a friend whose family they'd helped last month. Bill smiled as he reached for his pen, ready to begin the intake process that would transform this family's crisis into hope. Outside his window, the Hudson River flowed steadily toward the ocean, carrying with it the promise that sometimes, when you least expect it, doing the right thing leads to exactly where you're supposed to be. And in a mansion overlooking those same waters, William Ashworth sat in his library, reading reports about the Foundation's latest successes. The safe in the corner was closed, as it always was now, but sometimes he remembered that autumn day when an electrician had taught him that his father's lessons about character and integrity were still alive in the world. It had been the best investment he'd ever made, not just in a foundation, but in the proof that good people still existed, still chose what was right over what was easy, still believed that how you treat others when you have the power to hurt them says everything about who you really are. The test had revealed more than Bill Henderson's character. It had revealed the kind of world that was still possible when people chose to be better than their circumstances, when they remembered that integrity isn't just about the big moments, it's about all the small choices that add up to a life worth living. If you've ever wondered whether doing the right thing still matters in this world, remember Bill Henderson and the open safe. Remember that sometimes the hardest choice leads to the most extraordinary reward, and that character isn't what you do when people are watching, it's what you do when no one will ever know. The story of Bill Henderson reminds us that integrity isn't a luxury we can afford when things are going well, it's the foundation that holds us together when everything else falls apart. And sometimes, just sometimes, that foundation becomes the cornerstone of something beautiful.